Welcome back to All Levels English Podcast. I'm Sarah, and I'm here with my amazing co-host Michael. This is episode 3, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you with us today. If you've been following our journey, you know we covered daily English learning routines in episode 1, and those incredibly powerful listening and shadowing techniques in episode 2. Today, we're tackling something that honestly keeps me up at night sometimes: those sneaky, persistent grammar mistakes that even advanced English learners make without realizing it.
Hey everyone! Sarah, you're absolutely right about this being a crucial topic. You know what's fascinating? After our last 2 episodes, we received hundreds of messages from our listeners, and about 60% of them mentioned feeling frustrated about making the same grammar mistakes over and over again. Even learners who have been studying English for years, who can hold complex conversations and write professional emails, still find themselves making these errors. And the worst part, they often don't even realize they're doing it.
That's exactly what inspired today's episode, Michael. Grammar mistakes aren't just about correctness. They can actually interfere with communication and sometimes even change the meaning of what we're trying to say. But here's the thing that really gets me excited about this topic. Most of these common mistakes follow patterns. Once you understand the patterns and the reasons behind them, you can start catching yourself and making corrections. It's like having a grammar GPS in your brain.
I love that analogy. A grammar GPS, that's perfect. And you know what's really encouraging? These mistakes are completely normal and expected. Every single English learner I've ever worked with, from beginners to near-native speakers, has struggled with at least some of these issues. The key is awareness, practice, and patience with yourself. So Sarah, should we dive into our first category of common mistakes?
Absolutely. Let's start with subject-verb agreement, because this is probably the most fundamental area where I see consistent errors, even from advanced speakers. Michael, I think many listeners might be thinking, oh, subject-verb agreement, that's basic stuff. But the reality is much more complex than the simple rules we learn in textbooks.
You're so right, Sarah. The basic rule seems simple enough. Singular subjects take singular verbs, plural subjects take plural verbs. The cat runs, the cats run. Easy, right? But English loves to complicate things. Let me give you a perfect example that I hear constantly. The list of ingredients are on the table. I bet half our listeners just thought, that sounds right to me.
Oh my goodness, yes. That's such a perfect example because ingredients is right there before the verb, and it's plural, so our brain wants to match it with are. But the actual subject is list, which is singular. So it should be, the list of ingredients is on the table. This happens because we get distracted by what grammarians call intervening phrases, those prepositional phrases that come between the subject and verb.
Exactly. And this pattern shows up everywhere. A group of students are arriving should be, a group of students is arriving. The box of chocolates were expensive should be, the box of chocolates was expensive. The trick is to identify the true subject by asking yourself, what is actually doing the action? In these cases, it's the group that's arriving and the box that was expensive, not the students or chocolates.
This is such a crucial point, and I want to give our listeners a really practical tip here. When you're unsure about subject-verb agreement, try removing the prepositional phrase entirely and see if the sentence still makes sense. The list is on the table. A group is arriving. The box was expensive. If you can train yourself to mentally bracket out those intervening phrases, you'll catch these errors much more easily.
That's brilliant advice. But Sarah, let's not forget about another tricky area: compound subjects. I constantly hear things like John and Mary is coming to the party, or either the teacher or the students needs to change their schedule. These conjunctions and, or, either or, neither nor, they all have different rules and they can really confuse learners.
Oh, compound subjects are absolutely treacherous. Let's break this down for our listeners. When we have two subjects joined by and, we almost always use a plural verb because we're talking about more than one thing. John and Mary are coming to the party. The book and the pen are on the desk. This one is usually pretty straightforward.
Right, but then we get into the either or and neither nor situations, and this is where it gets really interesting. The rule here is that the verb agrees with the subject that's closest to it. So either the teacher or the students need to change their schedule is correct because students is closest to the verb. But if we flip it, either the students or the teacher needs to change the schedule, now we use the singular needs because teacher is closest.
And here's where it gets even more complex: indefinite pronouns. Michael, how many times have you heard someone say, everyone are excited about the party, or somebody have left their keys? These pronouns look like they should be plural because they refer to multiple people, but grammatically, they're singular.
All the time. This is probably one of the most common errors I hear from intermediate to advanced speakers. Words like everyone, everybody, someone, somebody, anyone, anybody, no one, nobody, they're all grammatically singular, even though they might refer to a group of people. Everyone is excited. Somebody has left their keys. Well, actually, that second example brings up an interesting point about pronouns, which I think might be our next topic.
Perfect transition, Michael. Pronouns are absolutely everywhere in English, and when we get them wrong, it can make our speech sound unclear or even confusing. And you just touched on one of the biggest pronoun challenges: the clash between grammatical correctness and natural usage, especially with singular.
Yes, this is such a contemporary issue in English. Traditionally, we were taught that if someone says someone left their keys, it's grammatically incorrect because someone is singular and their is plural. The traditional rule would require someone left his or her keys. But in natural, everyday English, most native speakers use their because it's more inclusive and sounds more natural.
And this is a perfect example of how language evolves. Modern English increasingly accepts singular, they, in both informal and formal contexts. Major dictionaries and style guides have embraced this usage. So our advice to listeners is, don't stress too much about this particular rule. Focus on being clear and natural rather than rigidly following outdated grammar prescriptions.
Absolutely. But let's talk about some pronoun issues that definitely do matter for clear communication. Sarah, what about pronoun reference problems? I constantly hear sentences like, when I told my sister about my promotion, she was really excited. And then the listener has no idea whether she refers to the sister or someone else who was mentioned earlier.
Oh, ambiguous pronoun reference. This is such a communication killer. The problem is that the speaker knows exactly what they mean, but the listener is left guessing. Here's an even more confusing example. John told Mark that he needed to finish his project by Friday. Who needs to finish whose project? John's project. Mark's project. Is John telling Mark about John's project, or is John telling Mark that Mark needs to finish Mark's project?
That's a perfect example of why clarity is so much more important than following every little grammar rule. In cases like this, it's often better to repeat the noun instead of using a pronoun. John told Mark that Mark needed to finish Mark's project by Friday. It might sound a little repetitive, but it's crystal clear.
Exactly. And speaking of clarity, let's talk about another pronoun issue that drives me crazy: misplaced modifiers with pronouns. I hear things like, after studying all night, the exam was still difficult for me. The problem is that it sounds like the exam was studying all night. The pronoun reference is completely wrong.
Yes. The grammatical subject of that sentence is exam, so it seems like the exam was doing the studying. It should be something like, after studying all night, I still found the exam difficult, or after I studied all night, the exam was still difficult for me. This type of error is called a dangling modifier, and it's incredibly common in both spoken and written English.
And while we're on the topic of pronoun confusion, we absolutely have to address the classic, me vs. I problem. Michael, I swear I hear this error at least 5 times a day, even from native speakers sometimes. Between you and I instead of between you and me. Or, my sister and me went to the store instead of my sister and I went to the store.
Oh, this one is so tricky because many people overcorrect. They've been told that me is wrong in certain contexts, so they start using I everywhere even when it's incorrect. The trick I teach my students is to remove the other person from the sentence and see what sounds right. Between you and I becomes between I, which obviously sounds wrong. It should be between you and me because between me sounds correct.
That's such a practical tip. Same thing works for subject position. My sister and me went to the store becomes me went to the store, clearly wrong. It should be my sister and I went to the store because I went to the store is correct. This little test can solve probably 90% of these pronoun case problems.
Sarah, should we move into what might be the most complex area of English grammar for non-native speakers, verb tenses? I think this is where we see the most variety in errors, from basic present-past confusion to the really advanced aspects of perfect and progressive forms.
Absolutely, and Michael, this is where I really want our listeners to understand that verb tense errors are completely normal and expected. English has more verb tenses than many other languages, and the way we use them doesn't always follow logical patterns. Even the names of the tenses can be confusing, like why do we call it present perfect when it often refers to past actions?
That's such a good point. Let's start with one of the most common issues I encounter, the simple present versus present continuous confusion. I constantly hear things like I am understanding English grammar or I am knowing the answer. These sound logical because the person is experiencing understanding or knowing right now in the present moment, but English doesn't work that way with stative verbs.
Right. Stative verbs, verbs that describe states rather than actions, generally don't take the continuous form. We don't say I am knowing, I am understanding, I am believing, I am owning, or I am seeming. Instead, we use the simple present. I know, I understand, I believe, I own, it seems. The continuous forms are reserved for action verbs and temporary situations.
But here's where English gets really tricky. Some verbs can be both stative and dynamic depending on the context. Take the verb think, for example. I think you're right uses the stative meaning, it's an opinion or belief. But I'm thinking about my vacation plans uses the dynamic meaning, it's a mental action happening right now.
Oh, that's such a perfect example of why English can be so frustrating for learners. The same verb, completely different grammatical behavior. Have is another one. I have a car, stative ownership versus. I'm having lunch, dynamic, the action of eating. See is similar. I see what you mean, stative understanding versus. I'm seeing a doctor tomorrow, dynamic, meeting with.
And speaking of have, let's talk about present perfect, because this is probably the tense that gives learners the most trouble. Sarah, I bet you hear errors like I already finished my homework instead of I've already finished my homework, or did you ever travel to Japan? Instead of have you ever traveled to Japan?
All the time. And I think the confusion comes from the fact that present perfect connects the past to the present in a way that doesn't exist in many other languages. When we say, I've finished my homework, we're not just talking about a past action, we're emphasizing that the completion of the homework is relevant to the current moment. Maybe it means I'm now free to do something else, or maybe someone asked if my homework was done.
Exactly. Present perfect is all about relevance to now. I lived in Paris for 5 years, simple past, suggests it's a completed period in the past with no connection to now. But I've lived in Paris for 5 years, suggests I still live there or it's still relevant to my current situation. The time frame is different. Simple past is about a specific time that's finished, present perfect is about an unfinished time frame.
And then we have those tricky time expressions that signal which tense to use. Already, yet, just, ever, never, since, for these almost always go with present perfect. Yesterday, last week, in 2019, when I was young, these go with simple past. I tell my students to listen for these signal words because they're like grammar GPS directions.
That's brilliant. And while we're talking about time expressions, let's address another major confusion for versus. Since. I hear I've been studying English since 5 years constantly when it should be I've been studying English for 5 years or I've been studying English since 2019. 4 is about duration, how long something has been happening. Since is about the starting point when it began.
And let's not forget about future tenses. Michael, how many different ways do we express future in English? I count at least 4 major ones, and learners often mix them up or overuse. Will for everything.
At least 4, you're right. We have will for predictions and decisions made at the moment of speaking, going to for plans and predictions based on evidence, present continuous for arrangements, and simple present for schedules and timetables. I'll help you with that spontaneous decision. I'm going to help you tomorrow, planned in advance. I'm helping you at 3 p.m. arranged appointment. The train leaves at 5:30 schedule.
And here's a really subtle point that even advanced learners miss. We often use present continuous for future events that feel certain or arranged. We're having dinner with my parents tonight sounds more natural than we will have dinner with my parents tonight, because it feels like a fixed arrangement. English speakers tend to avoid will when something feels planned or cert.
Sarah, should we tackle what might be the most inconsistent area of English grammar, articles? I think this is where we see the biggest difference between learners whose native languages have article systems and those that don't.
Oh my goodness, articles. Michael, I have students who can discuss quantum physics in English, but still struggle with whether to say the university or university, in hospital or in the hospital. And the frustrating thing is that articles often don't follow logical rules. There's so much variation between different varieties of English and so many exceptions.
That's so true. And what makes it even more challenging is that articles are usually unstressed in speech, so they're hard to hear and easy to miss. Plus, the rules we teach don't cover all the nuances of natural usage. Let's start with some of the most common errors. I constantly hear things like, I went to university from American English learners, when in American English it should be, I went to the university or I went to college.
Right. And that's a perfect example of how British and American English differ. In British English, I went to university is perfectly correct. It's talking about the concept of higher education in general. But in American English, we usually need the definite article. I went to the university refers to a specific institution, or we'd say, I went to college without an article because college functions differently than university in American usage.
These regional differences really trip people up. Another big one is medical contexts. In British English, you say in hospital when you're a patient, but in American English, it's always in the hospital. Same with at university versus at the university. There's no logic to it, it's just conventional usage that learners have to memorize.
And speaking of medical contexts, let's talk about body parts because this is another area where I see constant errors. English almost always uses possessive adjectives with body parts, not articles. My head hurts, not the head hurts. I broke my arm, not I broke the arm. But then we have exceptions like, he was shot in the leg, where we do use articles.
Yes. And it gets even more complex with abstract concepts. When do we use articles with abstract nouns? I love music, no article music in general, but I love the music in this restaurant, specific music. Happiness is important, no article the concept, but the happiness I felt that day was incredible, specific instance of happiness.
This is where I tell my students to think about specificity and whether the listener can identify exactly what you're referring to. If you say, I saw a movie last night, you're introducing a new topic. The listener doesn't know which movie. If you continue, the movie was really funny. Now you're referring to that specific movie you just mentioned, so you use the.
That's the perfect way to explain definite articles. But Sarah, what about zero articles, when we don't use any article at all? This might be even more confusing because learners have to resist the urge to put an article somewhere. Like with plural generalizations, dogs are friendly animals, not the dogs are friendly animals.
Zero articles are so tricky. We use them for general plural nouns, books are expensive. Uncountable nouns in general, water is essential for life. Proper nouns, London is beautiful. and certain fixed expressions by car, at home, in bed. But then we have exceptions like the United States or the internet, where we do use articles with proper nouns.
And let's not forget about meals. I had breakfast this morning, no article, but I had a delicious breakfast this morning, indefinite article because of the adjective. These little nuances are what make articles so challenging, even for advanced learners.
You know what I find really helpful for my students? I tell them to pay attention to articles when they're reading or listening, not just when they're producing language. Start noticing patterns. Why did the author use the here but not there? Why a instead of the? This kind of noticing can be more valuable than memorizing rules because it helps you develop intuition for natural usage.
Sarah, are you ready to tackle everyone's least favorite grammar topic? Prepositions. I swear, even native speakers sometimes pause and think, wait, is it on the weekend or during the weekend? And for learners, prepositions can feel completely arbitrary and impossible to master.
Oh, prepositions. They're like the final boss of English grammar. Michael, I think the reason prepositions are so difficult is that they often don't translate directly between languages, and English uses them in ways that can seem completely illogical. Why do we say in the morning, but at night? Why arrive at, but arrive in? There's often no logical explanation. It's just how English evolved.
Exactly. And what makes it worse is that prepositions are everywhere. You can't speak English for more than a few sentences without using multiple prepositions, so errors are really noticeable. Let's start with one of the biggest confusion areas, time prepositions. I constantly hear in the night instead of at night, or at Monday instead of on Monday.
Time prepositions follow some patterns, but they're not always intuitive. Generally, we use in for longer periods. In the morning, in the afternoon, in 2024, in January, in the summer. We use on for specific days. On Monday, on January 15th, on Christmas Day, on weekends in American English. And we use at for specific times. At 3 p.m., at noon, at midnight, at night.
But then we have all these exceptions. We say at night but in the evening. We say on the weekend in American English but at the weekend in British English. We say at Christmas when we're talking about the general time period but on Christmas when we're talking about the specific day. These inconsistencies drive learners crazy.
And speaking of location prepositions, this is another area where I see constant confusion. The basic rule seems simple. In for enclosed spaces, on for surfaces, at for points. I'm in the house, the book is on the table, I'll meet you at the library. But then we have in bed, even though you're on top of the bed, on the bus, even though you're inside it, and at home, even though you're inside your house.
Yes. Transportation prepositions are particularly tricky. We're in a car, taxi, or small boat, but on a bus, train, plane, or ship. The general rule is that if you can walk around inside the vehicle, you're on it, but if you can't, you're in it. But then we have exceptions like motorcycles and bicycles where you're on them, not in them, because you're not enclosed.
And don't even get me started on phrasal verbs. Michael, phrasal verbs are basically just prepositions attached to verbs, but they create completely new meanings that often have nothing to do with the original verb or preposition. Look up doesn't mean to physically look in an upward direction when you're talking about information. It means to research or find information.
Phrasal verbs are honestly like learning vocabulary more than grammar because the meanings are so unpredictable. Give up means quit, give in means surrender, give away means distribute for free, give back means return. The word give appears in all of them, but the prepositions completely change the meaning in ways that aren't logical or predictable.
What I find helpful is teaching students to think of phrasal verbs as complete vocabulary items, rather than trying to analyze the parts. Don't think of turn off as turn plus off. Just memorize that turn off means to stop a machine or device. The individual parts don't help you understand the meaning.
That's great advice. And speaking of advice, let's talk about dependent prepositions, those prepositions that are required after certain adjectives, verbs, and nouns. Interested in, good at, afraid of, depend on these combinations have to be memorized because they don't follow predictable patterns.
Right. I hear interested about instead of interested in, or good in instead of good at all the time. And sometimes the same word takes different prepositions depending on its meaning. Think about means to consider. Think of means to remember or have an opinion about. Consist of means to be made up of. Consist in means to have as the main element.
And here's something that really complicates things for learners. Sometimes the same idea can be expressed with different prepositions, and they're both correct but have slightly different connotations. He died of cancer versus he died from cancer. Both are acceptable, but died of is more common with diseases, while died from is more common with external causes.
You know what I tell my students? Don't try to memorize every preposition rule because there are too many exceptions. Instead, focus on the most common patterns and then read extensively, listen actively, and notice how native speakers use prepositions in context. Keep a notebook of preposition combinations that you encounter frequently, and practice using them in your own sentences.
Sarah, let's talk about conditionals because I think this is an area where even advanced learners make errors, and honestly, native speakers are often confused too. The classic question, if I was rich or if I were rich. And that's just the beginning. We have zero conditionals, first conditionals, second conditionals, third conditionals, and mixed conditionals.
Oh, conditionals. Michael, this is such a complex area because it combines verb tenses, hypothetical thinking, and some really archaic grammar rules that are slowly disappearing from modern English. Let's start with your example, if I was versus if I were. Traditionally, we use the subjunctive were for hypothetical or contrary to fact situations. If I were rich, I would travel the world. But in informal modern English, many native speakers say, if I was rich, and both are increasingly accepted.
Right. And I think this is a perfect example of where learners shouldn't stress too much about being perfect, according to traditional rules. Focus on being clear and natural. But let's talk about the more practical aspects of conditionals, the different types and when to use them, because this affects meaning and clarity much more than the was versus word debate.
Absolutely. Let's start with zero conditionals, because they're actually the simplest, but often get overlooked. Zero conditionals express general truths or scientific facts. If you heat water to 100 degrees Celsius, it boils. Both clauses use simple present tense because we're talking about something that always happens, not a hypothetical situation.
Exactly. Then we have first conditionals for real possibilities in the future. If it rains tomorrow, I'll stay home. The if clause uses simple present, and the main clause uses will plus base verb. This is for situations that could actually happen. There's a real chance it might rain tomorrow, so there's a real chance I might stay home.
But here's where I see a lot of errors. Students often use will in both clauses. If it will rain tomorrow, I'll stay home. That's incorrect. We don't use will in the if clause for first conditionals. The simple present in the if clause already indicates future possibility.
Great point. And then we move to second conditionals, which are for hypothetical or unlikely situations in the present or future. If I won the lottery, I would buy a house. We use simple past in the if clause and would plus base verb in the main clause. But it's not really past, it's hypothetical present or future.
And this is where that subjunctive, were, comes in. If I were rich is a second conditional because being rich is hypothetical for the speaker. The past tense form indicates that it's not real or likely. But Michael, what about third conditionals? These are probably the most complex and the most commonly messed up.
Third conditionals. These are for hypothetical situations in the past, things that didn't happen but we're imagining what would have happened if they had. If I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. Past perfect in the if clause would have plus past participle in the main clause. The structure is complex, but the concept is really useful for expressing regret or alternative outcomes.
And the errors I hear with third conditionals. If I would have studied harder, I would have passed. That's incorrect because we don't use would have in the if clause. Or if I had studied harder, I would pass, mixing up the time frames. Third conditionals are all about past hypotheticals, so both clauses need to reflect that past, unreal situation.
What makes conditionals even more challenging is mixed conditionals, where we combine different time frames. If I had studied medicine, I would be a doctor now, past condition with present result. If I were more organized, I wouldn't have missed the deadline yesterday, present condition with past result. These are actually very common in natural speech, but they combine elements from different conditional types.
And let's not forget about the many variations and alternatives to if. We can use unless, which means if not, provided that, as long as, in case, and others. Unless it rains, we'll have the picnic, means the same as if it doesn't rain, we'll have the picnic. But I hear learners say, unless it doesn't rain, which is a double negative and incorrect.
That's such a good point about unless. And what about in case versus? If I'll bring an umbrella in case it rains versus I'll bring an umbrella if it rains. The first suggests I'll bring the umbrella regardless, just as a precaution. The second suggests I'll only bring it if I think rain is likely. Small difference, but it affects meaning.
You know what I find really helpful for teaching conditionals? Start with the concepts rather than the grammar names. Don't worry about memorizing second conditional. Focus on understanding when you're talking about real possibilities, unlikely hypotheticals, or past alternatives. Once you understand the meaning you want to express, the grammar structure becomes more intuitive.
Sarah, let's talk about word order because this is an area where I see a lot of interference from students' native languages. English word order might seem flexible, but it actually follows quite strict patterns, and when those patterns are broken, sentences can sound very unnatural or even confusing.
Word order is so interesting, Michael, because it's one of those aspects of grammar that native speakers rarely think about consciously, but we notice immediately when it's wrong. English is primarily a subject-verb-object language, but there are so many nuances and exceptions. Plus, the placement of adverbs, adjectives, and other modifiers can completely change the meaning or naturalness of a sentence.
Exactly. Let's start with adverb placement because this is where I see the most errors. Different types of adverbs have different preferred positions in the sentence, and putting them in the wrong place can make sentences sound awkward. For example, I often hear, I always am tired after work instead of I am always tired after work.
Yes, adverbs of frequency like always, usually, often, sometimes, never have specific placement rules. They go after the verb be, I am always tired, before other main verbs, I always work late, but after auxiliary verbs in questions and negatives, are you always tired? I don't always work late. It seems complicated, but there's a logic to it.
And manner adverbs, the ones that describe how something is done, usually go at the end of the sentence. She speaks English fluently, not she fluently speaks English. Though actually, both can be correct depending on what you want to emphasize, but the end position is more natural in most contexts.
That's such an important point about emphasis. Word order in English often reflects information structure. What's new, what's important, what we want to highlight. But Michael, what about adjective order? This is something that even advanced learners struggle with. Why do we say a beautiful old Italian wooden table and not an Italian beautiful wooden old table?
Adjective order. This is one of those rules that native speakers follow instinctively but can't usually explain. There's actually a fairly specific order: opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose. So beautiful, opinion comes before old, age, which comes before Italian, origin, which comes before wooden, material. A beautiful old Italian wooden table follows this pattern perfectly.
And the amazing thing is that if you break this order, it sounds wrong to native speakers, even though most of us couldn't tell you why. An old beautiful table sounds odd compared to a beautiful old table. But here's the thing I tell my students: don't worry about memorizing this complex order. In natural speech, we rarely use more than 2 or 3 adjectives together, and when we do, we often separate them with and.
That's great practical advice. And speaking of order, let's talk about indirect and direct objects. I hear errors like I gave to my sister the book instead of I gave the book to my sister, or I gave my sister the book. The rules for this depend on whether you're using the preposition to or not.
Right. When we use the preposition to, the order is subject plus verb plus direct object plus to plus indirect object. I gave the book to my sister. But when we omit the preposition, the order changes. Subject plus verb plus indirect object plus direct object. I gave my sister the book. Both are correct, but you can't mix the patterns.
And this applies to other verbs too: show, tell, send, bring, make, buy. I showed the photos to my friends, or I showed my friends the photos. She made dinner for us, or she made us dinner. The key is being consistent with the pattern you choose.
Another area where I see word order problems is with questions, especially indirect questions. Direct questions use inversion. Where is the library? But indirect questions use statement. Michael, before we move to improvement strategies, let's quickly address some spelling and pronunciation issues that can make even perfect grammar look wrong. These homophones and commonly confused words trip up so many learners.
Absolutely. Let's start with advice versus advise. Advice is a noun. Can you give me some advice? Advise is a verb. I advise you to study harder. The pronunciation is different too. Advice ends with an S sound, while advise ends with a Z sound.
Another tricky pair is complement versus compliment. Compliment means to complete or make perfect. The wine complements the meal perfectly. Compliment means to praise. She gave me a nice compliment on my presentation. Even native speakers mix these up in writing.
And what about principal versus principal? Principal can be a noun, the head of a school, or an adjective meaning main, the principal reason for my decision. Principle is always a noun meaning a rule or belief. I won't compromise my principles.
Here's one that gets everyone: stationary versus stationary. Stationary means not moving. The car remains stationary. Stationary refers to writing materials. I bought some new stationery for the office. Memory trick: stationary has an E like envelope.
And let's be honest, social media and texting haven't helped these issues. People see your instead of your so often online that it starts to look normal. But in professional and academic contexts, these distinctions still matter enormously for credibility.
Michael, we've covered so much today, from subject-verb agreement to spelling confusions. How do we help our listeners turn this awareness into real improvement?
The key is focus, Sarah. Don't try to fix everything at once. Pick one grammar area you struggle with and focus on it for a full month. If it's articles, notice them everywhere in books, podcasts, conversations. Keep a notebook of examples.
I love error analysis too. When you catch yourself making a mistake, don't just fix it, understand the pattern. Oh, I always forget articles before abstract nouns. That awareness is the first step to improvement.
Recording yourself is incredibly powerful. Talk for 2-3 minutes about any topic, then listen back focusing on just one type of error. You'll discover patterns in your speech you never noticed before.
And here's something counterintuitive: make friends with your mistakes. Each error shows how your brain is processing English. If you say, I am understanding, your brain created a logical rule. It's just not the English rule. Understanding your patterns helps target practice.
Extensive reading and listening are crucial too. Grammar rules are just the skeleton. You need thousands of examples in context to develop real intuition. Read novels, news, blogs. Listen to podcasts, watch movies. Notice how native speakers actually use these structures.
Try this practical exercise. Find 5 examples of your problem grammar area used correctly this week. Write down complete sentences, not just the structure. Context makes everything more memorable than abstract rules.
Most importantly, be patient with yourself. Grammar acquisition is gradual. It's normal to understand a rule but still make mistakes when you're focused on communication. That gap closes with time and practice.
Remember, even native speakers make grammar errors. The goal isn't perfection, it's clear, natural communication. Don't let grammar anxiety stop you from speaking. Better to communicate imperfectly than not at all.
Perfect advice to end on, Sarah. Grammar serves communication, not vice versa. Focus on progress, not perfection, and celebrate every small victory along the way.
That's beautifully said, Michael. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of episode 3. We hope you found some useful insights and strategies to tackle those persistent grammar challenges.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, you don't have to master everything at once. Pick one area from today's episode and focus on that for the next few weeks.
Before we sign off, we're excited to tell you about episode 4. We're diving into strategic vocabulary building, word families, collocations, context clues, and memory techniques that make new words stick permanently.
It's going to be fantastic. We'll share methods to expand your vocabulary exponentially by understanding patterns and relationships, not just memorizing individual words.
Until then, keep practicing, keep noticing, and most importantly, keep using your English. Every conversation is grammar practice, and every mistake brings you closer to mastery.
Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time on All Levels English Podcast.
Goodbye for now, and happy learning.